Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined in the studio by Ash Sarkar. Great to have you in.
That restraining order couldn't keep me away for long, Michael.
That's a smear. I have never been convicted or anything like that. Coming up tonight, protests in Iran continue. I'll be speaking to author Arash Azizi about what these events mean for the country. Donald Trump is on a collision course with the US Federal Reserve. People are accusing the left of not caring about Iranian protesters. Me and Ash will be discussing that, as well as, I think, the hypocrisy from some of the people putting forward that charge. And a right-wing moral panic has been debunked by reality. Wait to the show to find out which one. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And as ever, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. Widespread protests in Iran have now entered their 16th day. And what began as a merchant strike in the capital Tehran in late December has over the past fortnight spread across dozens of towns and cities throughout the country. They've largely been clustered in big cities like Tehran, as well as Isfahan, Shiraz and Mashhad. Despite a crackdown by government forces in recent days, the protests don't seem to be showing much sign of settling. Though a communications blackout makes it difficult to verify reports from within the country, there is lots of footage which has been confirmed. We know that on Sunday, shops in a major bank in Tehran were set alight and plumes of black smoke were visible across the city's skyline as the protests entered their third day. Under cover of darkness, protesters also blocked streets and diverted traffic in the capital while chanting anti-regime slogans. Meanwhile, footage reportedly from Saturday shows a large group of protesters gathered along a highway in the city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran. As fires blaze, one protester holds up Iran's pre-revolutionary flag bearing the Lion and Son of the Shah. Some of Iran's protesters, like the ones you saw there, have been calling for the return to rule of the family of the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was deposed by the Islamic Revolution in 1979. His heir, Reza Pahlavi, appeared on Fox News on Sunday with this message for US President Donald Trump.
Mr. President, you have already established your legacy as a man committed to peace and fighting evil forces. There is a reason why people in Iran are renaming streets after your name. They know that you are totally opposite to Barack Obama or Joe Biden. They know that you're not going to throw them under the bus as they have had before. This is why they believe that this time they are empowered by the hope that you have their back. Your words of solidarity with the Iranian people and your administration has had tremendous positive effect. Let's hope that we can permanently seal this legacy by liberating Iran so that we and you can make Iran great again.
Now, it's worth pointing out this isn't the first time the wannabe Shah has encouraged attacks against his own country. In the summer, while Israel was bombing Iran, Pahlavi appeared on the BBC.
So ultimately, anything that weakens the regime, anything that pushes more to its back is something that people welcome for obvious reasons, because they see that strangulation that holds them in that position beginning to loosen on their necks. This is something positive and not negative.
Are you actually saying then that Israel bombing your country, civilians in Iran being killed, is a positive thing?
I'm not saying that the targeting was meant to hurt the Iranian people. The targeting was meant to basically neutralize the regime threat. Clearly, I don't think that it was an intention of the Israeli government to attack Iranian civilians.
Of course, the Israeli government would never attack civilians. For his part, Trump appears to be considering Pahlavi's call. On Saturday, the New York Times reported that US military staff had briefed the president on his options for airstrikes against Iran, which he said would, quote, help the protesters. And by last night, the temperature had been turned up a notch. This was Trump facing the press pool aboard a turbulent Air Force One.
There seem to be some people killed that aren't supposed to be killed. These are violent, if you call them leaders, I don't know if they're leaders or just they rule through violence. But we're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it. And we're looking at some very strong options.
Can I ask how you're balancing and how you're deciding your response, the balance between helping protesters versus hindering them? Because I imagine that's a delicate balance to strike.
I mean, some of the protesters were killed through the stampeding. I mean, there's so many of them, and some were shot. We're getting a full report. I'm getting an hourly report, and we're going to make a determination.
The son of the disposed Shah and some military leaders are encouraging you to take action in Iran. Is that a serious option? And are you listening?
People have been shot, and we're looking at it.
Now, it goes without saying, Donald Trump is far from a consistent opponent of state violence. Just last week, he personally defended the shooting at point-blank range of a woman by ICE in Minneapolis. It also stretches credulity that if Trump were motivated to intervene, it would be because of his horror at state violence. As Israel committed a genocide in Gaza, he was focused mainly on which part of the Strip would be best for a new Trump hotel. But putting that to one side, there is little doubt that the regime of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has tried to quell the Iranian uprising with intense violence, according to the US-based human rights activists in Iran. Deaths from the protests have now reached more than 500. Other reports have speculated the death toll could be much higher. And footage, which some viewers might find upsetting, from one morgue in Tehran suggests a high level of state violence. Now, footage posted online shows dozens of bodies lined up across several hundred meters of the tarmac in body bags outside the Karizak Forensic Center south of Tehran. In the audio version, you can hear sobs and screams coming from different directions as friends and family appeared to search through the dead for their loved ones. Some figures within the Iranian government have blamed foreign-led terrorism for the deaths. Iranian news agency Tasnim reported this from senior government official Ali Larijani on Saturday. So Larijani said, while a group of people had held rightful protests against economic difficulties, a destructive and organised current stepped in to divert the economic demands and incite violence. He stated that the criminal activities such as killing people and arson attacks closely resemble the methods used by terrorist groups like Daesh, ISIS, warning that such violent measures would only harm the society, upset security and result in consequent economic stagnation. Today, however, instead of emphasising the apparent threat posed by protesters and smearing them as ISIS, the Iranian government claimed it had quelled them. So state TV has been playing wall-to-wall coverage of mass pro-regime protests from across Iran, showing thousands of people taking to the streets. Those marches follow authorities declaring 3 days of national mourning on Sunday. There are also signs the government may be spooked by the threat of US intervention. So in response to Donald Trump's threat of a potential military action against Iran, the country's foreign minister has today said this on state TV. We are not looking for war, but we are prepared for war, even more prepared than the previous war. We are also ready for negotiations, but negotiations that are fair with equal rights and mutual respect. European leaders are now piling their own pressure on the government. The EU's Foreign Affairs representative, Kaja Kallas, has threatened even tougher sanctions on Iran over its response to the protests. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has said this: "We condemn this violence in the strongest possible terms. This violence is not an expression of strength, but rather a sign of weakness. This violence must end. For 2 weeks now, we have seen more and more people from all parts of society taking to the streets across the country. They are demonstrating peacefully for freedom and for a better life in their country. That is their right. The greatest respect is due to them for the courage with which they are resisting the disproportionate brutal violence of Iranian security forces." I'm joined now by Arash Azizi, a contributing writer at The Atlantic, a lecturer at Yale University and the author of 2 books on Iran. Thank you so much for joining us. Could we begin by, I suppose, you explaining what your understanding is of how these protests developed over the weekend?
The protests had began in late December over cost of living, and quickly they acquired a political character because people see the economic failures of the regime, and they put it directly on this unaccountable regime, which has been led by one man, Ayatollah Khamenei, since 1989, who controls most of the power and is accountable to no one. But the last few years, after also Pahlavi's call for certain action, he does have some supporters in Iran, although a minority, I would say overall. It escalated, and people came out in really massive numbers, and they brought it to the government. But unfortunately, there has been rounds of protests in Iran in 2017, 2019, in the previous years, and they all demand the same thing, which is instead of a change in the regime. But unfortunately, they lack organized networks in Iran, and also lack a kind of a leadership that could be inclusive, that could bring people together, and then could bring about a transition and cause a crack in the security forces, as all successful revolutionary movements do. So this lack is already there also. And also in the last couple of days, there was an internet blackdown. Unfortunately, a lot of us had problems getting in touch with our families and friends, but also a brutal response by the government. I think, when things are clear, the number of the killed it's going to be a scary high, and it's probably the most violent crackdown we've seen since the 1980s of the regime. I mean,
I suppose just because it is difficult for people to know what information to trust here, because it's difficult to get information out of Iran. I suppose, could you give us some insight into how is it that you've come to this conclusion that you think this could be the bloodiest crackdown in decades? What information are you getting that leads you to believe that?
It's speaking to different people in different parts of the country, but also, the sort of verified number of the dead that, more cautious organizations look at, it's already into the hundreds. But also is the kind of shooting directly at the protesters. This didn't happen early on, but in the last few days, from January 8th onwards, it did seem to happen. And when I compare it to the previous rounds, so, from 1999, 2009, 2017 and others, you didn't have this kind of you had it in certain places that they would shoot directly at the protesters, but the way it has happened now in much bigger crowds, seems leads me to conclude that numbers are high. And while there might be some disagreement here and there, but sources like Amnesty International and others, I think will end up coming to the same conclusion. But it is true, Michael, that it's hard to, even in 2019, very different numbers were given. And I think the fact that it's brutal and a lot of ordinary people are killed. I personally know someone who was killed in northern Iran. The fact is there. Now, what the actual numbers are, it's going to be difficult to know, and sometimes you wouldn't know until years after.
The government seem to have shifted their rhetoric to be suggesting that now they've kind of quelled the protests. So I suppose they're giving an image that they have re-established control. They've been pro-government protests. Obviously, there's lots of debate about how genuine those are, if people are paid or pressured to go on them, or if there is clearly there is some support for the regime in Iran. Maybe you can tell me how genuine you think those protests are. But the broader question, do you think that they are correct to suggest they've quelled these protests?
Look, as for the genuine support of the regime, I think about 10 to 15% of the Iranian society are sort of really a base of the regime. And I say this based on election numbers, for example. So when hardliner candidates run in the Iranian presidential elections, like in 2024, that's about the number that they'll vote for them. Something like 10 to 15 million, I would estimate it. Although some of them are also sort of, because of the economic issues, they turn, like any other society. But that's really the base of the regime, which means that these marches are indeed, a stage, and they bring a lot of people. As with most, regimes like that they can do stuff like that. As to whether they've quelled, look, there is a limit to what people can do. They come out in massive numbers and they're killed in massive numbers. And yes, a sort of quelling. Now, I can't predict, the future and what will happen. When is the next time Iranians will come out? It's incredible how, my brave compatriots have come out wave and wave again in last few years, despite knowing that they'll be killed. And these are not like some people that you don't know. I have many friends and family that I spoke to, throughout these years who keep on protesting despite knowing the risks. So, they might come out again, but they are at a strategic impasse against the regime unless they're able to get a political leadership that can actually, negotiate the transition of power at some point, right? That's what you need. Also workers' strikes that are strategic factors, strategic sectors, which Pahlavi called for, actually. But of course, it's one thing to call for, but why would they answer to him when he has effectively led a right-wing movement in the last couple of years, as you sort of gestured that as well. So, and he doesn't seem to have the organizing networks inside Iran. And the Iranian trade unions, Iranian left-wing forces have also not been strong enough to be able to organize the kind of action that can really bring about a revolution. So, this problem remains. But I do say, in many ways, Islamic Republic, as we know it, the writing is on the wall for it. Under the combined pressure of domestic pressure of the revolutionary movements that you see and other sort of protests, and external pressure from US and Israel, it would probably have to change its core policies and, in fact, even its core structures. Khamenei is going to be 87 in April. So already, even if you asked me this question before the protest in November, I'd say that the writing is on the wall for this regime, and it will have to change its core policies. It's just that the status quo is so untenable that they would have to change it, and that's always, throughout this, it has been my opinion that unfortunately I wish the revolutionary movement of Iranian people could get a leadership that would represent the broad swaths of the Iranian people and bring about a democratic transition. But since we failed in doing that, still the more likely outcome is that some internal, some different sections of the regime will lead that kind of transition. As I said, change some of the core policies and core structures. And to be clear, what I mean by core policies is that they'll get rid of not of political repression, but of social repression. So they wouldn't enforce the mandatory hijab, they wouldn't try to Islamicize society, and they would cut a deal with the United States and ultimately, indirectly with Israel, so that that they would cut a deal with them, that they would get these countries off the back of Iran and try to make Iran and sort of integrate Iran into regional order somehow.
What do you mean by cut a deal? Because, from my perspective, what the Israelis seem to want is they want the current regime to collapse, and they wouldn't mind if the Iranian state completely collapsed and it sort of ended up being a situation of state failure, because that would give them, complete license to do whatever they want. They want a rival got rid of. They don't necessarily just want a slightly more moderate rival. They want to be the only superpower in the Middle East. So is it, I suppose, two questions. Is it a bit naive to think that this current regime could sort of suddenly get Israel to be okay with them and therefore get the Americans to be okay with them? And if you do think there is some deal to be made, what would that consist of? Because obviously many people look at Iran, and however unpleasant some of the policies of the government may be, they are one of the more forthright people when it comes to imposing some costs on Israel when it comes to their genocidal war against Palestinians in Gaza. So I suppose, talk me through your previous answer, because I think it might be raising some red flags among some in our audience.
No, for sure, I'm happy to explain. First of all, yes, it is true and entirely rational to worry that Israel would actually want the collapse of the Iranian state, that it would want Iran to just not be that the best way for it to ensure that Iran is not a threat is that Iran as such doesn't exist, that there's civil war, that Iran is threatened. And frankly, what Israel has tried to do in Syria shows that certainly this current Israeli government and many in the Israeli state would like to see something like that, and it goes also with their with some of the longer thinking there. So that's definitely a threat, and I would say that is the worst case scenario for Iran. Of course, if we have some sort of a collapse, that would be a terrible outcome for everybody involved. But even if they want that, they don't always get what they want. Iranian state and Iranian nation are also not, they're not born yesterday, and it's not so easy to just, cut us into pieces or to do things like that. So, it's not going to be so simple for them to affect something like that. Iran is not in the situation like Syria, for example, that had gone through this long civil war and that already was sort of cut up into little different statelets already before even the Israeli interventions. And the United States is a different also. And I think, by the way, the collapse of the Iranian state would also set alarms in all the American allies in the region. Saudis won't like it. Turkey wouldn't like it. Other countries in the region wouldn't like it. So it's not just, so even if Israelis decide to bring that about, it's not like they can just get it. Now, what kind of a deal it could be? Look, it could be a deal in which Iran makes a deal over its nuclear program for it not to be a threat. Effectively, it's not much of a threat anymore. And also that Iran would stop supporting the sort of Arab militias that it has supported in different countries. And I want to say something and actually, maybe challenge you a little bit on this question of Iran having imposed a cost in Israel. Actually, Iran's support for these regional militias, the so-called axis of resistance, has killed tons of more Arabs, cost more Arab lives than has cost anything on Israel. It helped kill hundreds of thousands of people in Syria. It helped kill many in Lebanon and in Iraq. And it's very hard to see Iranian intervention in any of these countries positive, which is why Iranian protesters have shouted against these interventions. It's sort of an anti-interventionist policy. Just like American progressive would not like the United States to help Israel. Iranians were also not happy with their country, helping the Assad regime in Syria and other forces in the region. And also in Palestinian life, it hasn't really been a positive force at all. It has intervened in Palestinian politics, and effectively, even inside Hamas, in the politics inside Hamas, it helped factions of Hamas to align them with this axis of resistance. but it wasn't even ready to really help them when the war came. And I think that's not a controversial sort of for many mainstream Palestinian voices like Rashid Khalidi, he's a renowned Palestinian historian, has pretty much said the same thing. So I think to view the Iranian role negatively in the Arab affairs and Palestinian affairs, that's how I view it, and I think that's how many Palestinians and others would view it as well. So what kind of a deal it could be? As I said, it could be a deal that affects Iran's nuclear program, and effectively the axis of resistance is dead anyways. But that it would have Iran more integrated into the region in this way, as I said, and that could mean, of course, what it would gain for Iran is important. It would lead to the lifting of the sanctions, and it could it could lead to the lifting of sanctions and betterment to the economy. So for the same reason that many of us supported the 2015 Iran deal under Obama, which Trump opposed, of course, that those were the consequences that we were hoping would come from the Iran deal, and they did, frankly, in some ways before Trump quit it. Those are for the same reasons that I view something like that a little positively, of course, although I would prefer a democratic transition and for Iranians to decide their own fate. But it's a very difficult job. And in terms of, I think you were just asking about feasibility of such a thing happening. I think it is possible for it to happen. But of course, Trump is also not a easy man to make deals with, and Iran has it really hard. It's really walked itself into a sort of terrible quagmire of a position. And again, this is a very mainstream view amongst Iranian security analysts. Iranian regime's own security analysts, they have a very distaste for Khamenei now, frankly, and what his leadership had brought, because it has brought us into war with Israel and the United States. It has cost more than 1,000 innocent Iranians were killed in the Israeli-American war last year. And it has brought these sanctions that has destroyed our economy. So Iran is in a very tough spot, no matter who led it.
Just in terms of this language of it, it's brought Iran into war with Israel and the United States. I mean, it's very clear that in Israel, what the government there want to do is ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, and Netanyahu wants a greater Israel where, there is Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. And so, maybe it would have been better for the Iranian people for Iran just to keep out of the conflict. But I suppose there will be many people looking at this situation and saying, oh, Iran's saying, let's just take a step back from the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or the genocide of the Israelis against the Palestinians. You might say that actually their policies haven't benefited Palestinians. I'm sure it's up for debate, but the idea that sort of they chose the conflict with Israel and they chose the conflict with the United States, that's probably going to provoke some strong reactions.
They chose the conflict. Who else chose the conflict? Yes, Israel has committed terrible atrocities and genocide against the Palestinians. But why is Algeria not being attacked? Why is Morocco not being attacked? Morocco has relations with Israel, but let's even talk about anti-Israel countries in the region. Why is Algeria not attacked? Why is Turkey not attacked? Why are so many other countries in the region not attacked? So why would Iran need to be in conflict?
None of those countries.
And Iran has threatened to destroy Israel. This is the other thing. Iran hasn't just said. Iran's position is very clear. First of all, it has threatened to destroy Israel. It has supported these groups for years, tried to kill Israelis, as much as they could. And also Iran's diplomatic position is that Israeli Jews should have no right to be there. In the 2019, if you look at the plan that Iran gave to the UN, it made that clear. All Israeli Jews, effectively, or vast majority of Israeli Jews, it believes have no need to be there. So obviously some of this aggression has also sort of come from Iran. And also with the United States, Iran organizes Death to America rallies every year. Our country has been in this conflict with the United States since 1979. So let me give you an answer as to what Nasrin Sotoudeh, the Iranian human rights lawyer, said when she was supporting South Africa when South Africa took Israel to court on genocide charges in ICJ. Which she said, this is what Iran could have done. Iran could have led the charges against Israelis in ways that were productive and also that were in line with Iran's national interest. So it's something to have Palestine in your heart and want to support them. But the question is, the price that Iranians have paid for this government's policy. And as I said, as I tried to explain, we can definitely have a debate about it, but I don't think it has been good for Palestinians either. If you look at Iran's support from the 1990s, its supports for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others, this intervention in Palestinian politics, I don't think it has been good for Palestinians in any ways. But at any rate, from the Iranian perspective also, we had no reason to be in this conflict. We had no reason to be in conflict with Israel and the United States. In a direct conflict.
Arash, Azizi, we're going to have to leave it there. It would be good to get you on for a proper debate at some point, because you've got quite a different perspective from lots of the people we get on. But thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate your time. Donald Trump has for a while now been attacking the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. Donald Trump wants the Fed to quickly lower interest rates to turbocharge the economy. Jerome Powell, who's the chair of the Fed, wants to lower them more slowly so as not to risk increased inflation. Now, the Federal Reserve is formally independent, so legally, it's not supposed to respond to the demands of any president, be that Trump or anyone else. But Trump has been piling on the pressure, which has now reached fever pitch. This was an extraordinary video put out by the Federal Reserve last night. The speaker is the Fed chair, Jerome Powell.
Good evening. On Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. That testimony concerned in part a multi-year project to renovate historic Federal Reserve office buildings. I have deep respect for the rule of law and for accountability in our democracy. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. The Fed, through testimony and other public disclosures, made every effort to keep Congress informed about the renovation project. Those are pretexts. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. I have served at the Federal Reserve under 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats alike. In every case, I have carried out my duties without political fear or favor, focused solely on our mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do, with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people. Thank you.
So that video came as a big shock to lots of people, because normally the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the White House is a fairly technocratic one. There'll often be some sort of tension, but the idea that a chair of the Federal Reserve would come out and do a piece to camera saying, I'm under attack by the president is completely unheard of. What's happening here, as I say, is Donald Trump doesn't like that the Federal Reserve isn't following his wishes. So he's threatening the Fed chair with criminal charges, which seem completely trumped up. Of course, what this suggests is that if Trump gets his way, interest rates could be determined by politicians instead of technocrats, and therefore inflation could go up. That obviously also just highlights the chaos which reigns in Washington. You've got, there's supposed to be this very formal relationship where you've got Congress and the president here and then an independent central bank here. What instead you've got is a president saying, I'm going to put you in jail if you don't follow my orders. So we should expect more chaos. We should expect more inflation. However, the markets don't seem too bothered. So the price of gold and silver have reached record highs. Now, that is what you'd expect if investors lose confidence in the dollar. So sort of some of them do seem to be a bit worried about this fight between the Federal Reserve and the president. However, financial observers were expecting there to be a bigger response in the bond market, and that hasn't happened yet. So investors in the bond market seem relatively chilled, hasn't really moved. People say, oh, there's the Federal Reserve is no longer independent, but no biggie. Adam Tooze on his Substack gave this possible explanation of why that might be. So he says the Treasury market will really worry about the Fed when there are tough macroeconomic choices to make. And right now, that is not the case. though the Trump administration wants more rate cuts, the Fed is not exactly in a hawkish stance, even from the Trumpian point of view. Powell is dragging his feet rather than actually defying the president. The clash would only become acute if inflation in the US were rising. Then the Fed would feel obligated to respond by raising rates that would really set the cat amongst the pigeons and unleash Trump's fury. Until that time, so the story goes, as of 7:30 a.m. on Monday, this is a storm in a teacup, or rather it is a story like those about ICE, not a matter for the markets to really worry about. Then he goes on. But if this is true, it is true that all the markets care about are technical points of macroeconomics, that they will ignore a transparent effort to legally coerce the Fed chair, then this underlines the point about the loss of political coherence within the US elite. Institutions don't matter. All that matters are the flows of money and power. As far as political economy goes, it is a moment of sheer nihilism. So I suppose that translated, he's basically saying, if this were a moment when inflation was increasing and therefore you'd want the Fed to tighten, or the markets might want the Fed to tighten monetary policy, and the president really wanted them to lower interest rates, then that's a clash that they might worry about. But because they think, well, interest rates were going down anyway, this is just about the pace, it doesn't matter that much. So they haven't had a reaction. What Adam Tooze is suggesting is that might be a little bit short-sighted, because basically the whole system that governed economic stability in the United States, we have an independent central bank, you have the president here, you have the Congress there, and they all have a division of power. Now you have a president who's willing to just say, okay, well, maybe constitutionally I can't control what you do, but I will set the Department of Justice onto you, and maybe you'll go to jail. Adam Tooze is suggesting that maybe if investors were a bit more, thought about what could happen in a few years from now or a decade from now instead of what's going to happen over the next 6 months, they might be a bit more worried about this.
Well, I mean, I think that this is something which lots of people on the left might take for granted a little bit, right? It's almost a cliche to say, well, elites aren't really interested in politics, philosophy, morality, values, or the rule of law. What they care about is money and power for themselves on a short-term basis. And I think it's one of those things that just because it's a cliche doesn't mean it's untrue, and also doesn't mean that it's not something which has been proved true time and again through different historical periods. This kind of reminds me of something that I was talking about on Friday, which is the mark of Trumpism and Trump's attitude towards the rule of law, whether that's international law on the global stage or thinking about constitutional arrangements in the United States. It's less about seeing the law as something which can constrain him in what he wants to do. He views the law as either an opponent to sort of be bulldozed through or an instrument to be used for his own purposes. So this kind of criminal investigation into the chair of the Federal Reserve is obviously weaponizing law for a particular end. And I think it was Nicholas Rakovich who said that it's the rule of guns and lawyers that defines Donald Trump. And I think that this is something which you can see in terms of how he conducted his business practices, particularly in real estate, and you're seeing that translate into politics. I mean, the second thing, which is what I'm really interested in, is to what extent does Trump's war on Federal Reserve independence reflect attitudes which are in the electorate? And I think that it's safe to say that there isn't necessarily a lot of love for these institutions. Right? Obviously, people want an economy which is stable, not volatile, not subject to inflationary shocks, that kind of thing. But I don't think anyone says their prayers at night and goes, grandma and granddad and mum and dad and my kids and the Federal Reserve, right? Like, I don't think it's that close to people's hearts. And I think that it is because of the principle of Federal Reserve independence and Bank of England independence and central bank independence of all kinds. It is founded on sort of being insulated from democratic accountability of any kind. And that's the selling point of it, right? You're sort of saying to the market, saying to investors, your decision-making is going to be relatively protected in certain ways from the vagaries of democracy.
And it's going to be predictable. That's the key thing, right? The US monetary policy is going to be predictable. You can invest with us because we're not just going to wildly change our policy on a whim.
And, there are certain laws of physics almost. When this happens, then this will happen. Okay, all right. So there's inflation. Okay, well, there's going to be a response of interest rates going up. But obviously, all of these things have political consequences. And you have these institutions which are uniquely shielded from the consequences of decisions that they make. So if you want to look at the 2007-2008 financial crisis, you could say, well, the expansion of credit, which is a decision taken by the central banks, that then encourages the kind of reckless lending practices which result in a financial crisis that saw people have their homes foreclosed on and, lose everything that they own. You can then look at something like quantitative easing, which, has a consequence of absolutely turbocharging inequality, because if you are rich and you own financial assets, you get very rich. But if you're just like a normal saver and you're putting money away, interest rates are low, so your money is just losing value. And then when you look at something like interest rates going up, which is a response to inflationary shocks, right? Because you're trying to say, oh shit, people are spending too much money, it's driving the price of goods up, so we want people to spend less money, so we're going to make it more expensive to borrow. If you've got loads of money in savings, great for you. You're having a wonderful time. Your interest rates have gone up. But everyone else is like, oh no, my mortgage payments have gone up. My car repayments have gone up. And these are all things that Trump's electoral base are thinking about. So you are much more likely to break for Donald Trump in the 2024 election if your household finances were a big concern for you. So that's what Trump's thinking about, right? He's saying, well, my base cares about this kind of stuff. I don't want those decisions in the hands of some jabroni who, isn't one of my people. That's where he's coming from. And I think that there are all sorts of reasons to be concerned about undermining of, the independence of institutions. But it's not the sort of cri de coeur of a movement to be protect the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I mean, there was some good mock-ups on Twitter today of school walkout for Jerome Powell. Sort of the idea that there's going to be this huge mass movement to protect Jerome Powell from Donald Trump. I don't think that's going to happen. But, I mean, central bank independence is probably going to be a very big issue over the next few years. I mean, there's lots of people on the left that think that there should be more democratic control of central banks. We had an interview recently on this show where precisely that was argued by Daniela Gabor. She thinks that the central bank is constraining the actions of democratically elected governments more than it should do. So in many ways, maybe weakening central bank independence would be a good thing, although obviously Trump having more power tends to not be great for anyone. The protests in Iran are difficult to make sense of. The protesters have, of course, legitimate grievances and demands, and they're being violently repressed by a theocratic government. It's also the case that Israel and the United States see this as an opportunity to bring about state collapse. Not a good option, right? It's complex, and that's okay. But that's not okay for Britain's right-wing commentators. For them, this is simple, and more than anything, it's an opportunity to bash the left. This was from Daily Mail columnist Sarah Vine. She said this: "It's soul-sapping to think that the left in Britain would rather support a bunch of misogynistic, grey-haired clerics than come out in support of the fearless youth of an entire nation facing down bullets in an attempt to claim their lives back." JK Rowling had a similar take. So she said this: "If you claim to support human rights yet can't bring yourself to show solidarity with those fighting for their liberty in Iran, you've revealed yourself. You don't give a damn about people being oppressed and brutalized so long as it's being done by the enemies of your enemies." The Telegraph, meanwhile, put out a whole article on the topic. So it's by someone called George Chesterton, uses the term Western derangement syndrome to describe what he calls extreme leftist campaigning in support of one of the most murderous regimes in the world. That's his words. In the article, he writes this: "Opposing the efforts of the Iranians themselves to overthrow the clerics who've kept them in bondage since 1979 is a leap into genuine madness. It is the most worrying symptom yet of Western derangement syndrome, the belief that anything and anyone opposed to the West is preferable to the horrors of liberal democracy, even if that means supporting a regime that has executed 1,500 of its own people in 2025, treats women like chattel, criminalizes homosexuality, and sponsors global terrorism." To my mind, there's a flaw in all of these arguments, because, I mean, beyond the furthest fringes of the left, no one is backing the Iranian government. Many, though, are saying that regime change, especially if it's precipitated by Israel or the United States, might not be so rosy. right? Say, just because some protesters have a legitimate demand, that doesn't necessarily mean that saying, okay, brilliant, let's support the Americans taking out the Ayatollah Khamenei is going to be a good idea, right? We've seen regime change in the Middle East or in West Asia happen a lot in recent years. And while there have often been, protesters with legitimate demands who are calling for brilliant things, the outcome hasn't always been brilliant. And by the way, for many people, especially Israel, that's no bad thing. They want to be surrounded by very weak states. So where I stand on this is that I think it's very unhelpful and a bit offensive for people to sort of say, oh, anyone protesting in one of these countries is just a tool of the Israelis. I think that's ridiculous. But to also say that there aren't powerful interests that would like this to not be a more democratic liberal state, but rather to be a failed state, it would be naive to suggest that that isn't also a reality here. Also, of course, many people suspicious of scenes like this. So this was from a pro-Shah protest outside the Iranian embassy in London on Sunday, where Iran's pre-revolutionary flag, the one carrying the lion and the sun, was frequently waved in a strange hybrid with Israeli flags as well. Israeli flags on a demonstration, of course, doesn't mean that any cause should be dismissed. You can't choose your backers. You can have a really valid cause and then some people who you disagree with turn up. I mean, that was often the case with the Gaza protest, wasn't it? That someone might turn up with a protest asking for, in support of some kind of theocratic regime. That doesn't delegitimize the protest. However, the Shah did back Israel's bombing of Iran last year. It's also a bit rich seeing the left lectured about their supposed hypocrisy by people who had nothing to say about the war against Palestinians in Gaza, which killed an order of magnitude more people than the current crackdown by the Iranian government. So, for example, this is the number of times Sarah Vine has tweeted about Gaza. So I searched this today. No results. So there's been a genocidal war going on for over 2 years now. Not a single tweet where Gaza is mentioned. And JK Rowling appears to bring up exactly the same result. Nothing. She just hasn't tweeted the word Gaza once. Ash, where do you stand on this? I mean, personally, I think there is some legitimate critique to be made sometimes where people can say, oh, well, if the Iranian regime is against Israel, then therefore the people against the Iranian regime must be tools of Israel. That does exist. But also, these right-wingers suddenly getting on their high horse and saying, well, if you cared so much about Palestine, why don't you care about Iran? It's like, you didn't even care about Palestine.
It's just like, what are you, the director of events for protesters? You're like, okay, chop chop, everyone. Like, go to that one now. No lollygagging. I mean, look, what it's about is a form of negative identification. So negative identification is where you derive a sense of self based on what you're not rather than what you are. And you see this all the time. And it's not just unique to centrists and the right. You also see it on the left. Anyone who uses social media tends to have a tendency towards negative identification because it's a system that works on guilt and social shaming and, a feeling that people are yelling at you. You end up so down the rabbit hole of wanting to define yourself against those people. So you end up taking really bizarre political positions because you're constantly thinking about who you're distancing yourself from. So I don't think you can understand any of this stuff without thinking about the sort of anti-Corbyn moral panic and in particular the role of anti-Semitism accusations within it, where for elite opinion formers who were, on the centre and on the right, it was seen as sort of a moral stain to be in any way sympathetic to Corbynism because of the anti-Semitism allegations. And then that sort of spreads out to the left, right? So you end up not wanting to say anything about Gaza or Palestine or the genocide because you don't want to be put in proximity to people that you've built up a whole load of your sort of online presence as smearing as like anti-Semites and idiots and extremists and all the rest of it. And so then you start interpreting everything through that frame. So you look at the protests in Iran, which I think as our last guest discussed, there's lots of things I disagreed with that he said. But one of the things that I thought was really important is that he said, well, look, this starts out as something to do with the cost of living. And then it grows and it grows. But you're involving a lot of different sections of Iranian society who are being motivated by different reasons. But this beginning things to do with the cost of living. That's not anything that you hear in Western media. Instead, it's being framed as being about sort of a secular, liberal, rejection of Islam. Now, of course, that's there in parts. The pervasive and draconian role of the morality police has been hugely important, in particular in the 2022 protests. But those are the bits which are sort of picked up on by, Western opinion formers, because then it goes, oh, the left, you're supposed to be feminist, but you're not standing with these women. And all it really comes back to is that somebody in 2015 or 2016 called them a centrist dad or a slug or a melt or something like that. And then you have this sort of like domino effect of being like, I stand with the Shah.
Because it's also not the case. So when people, because they'll say, well, all this negative polarization happened to us. You did exactly the same to us when it came to Palestine. Now, I mean, I think in many ways, the case against the genocide against the Palestinian people was more clear cut, which was that Israel should have just stopped doing the genocide. Whereas in Iran, as we've been discussing, I mean, it's very difficult to know what the outcome of various situations would be. If these protests are successful, does that improve the lives of Iranian people? Very, very unclear to me. But putting that to one side, one of the reasons why people on the left got very annoyed about people in positions of significance in British society who wouldn't speak out about Gaza is because our government had an active role. And if our government were under more pressure, maybe they would have changed their position. And so therefore, because elites do shape, well, elites by definition shape elite opinion, and that can impact the government. That's why, maybe sometimes it went a bit overboard, people obsessing over whether this band or that band had said anything about Palestine, whatever. But the idea, there was some rationale to it, at least, of saying there is some plausible mechanism whereby by pressuring this celebrity or this politician to speak out about Gaza, that will lead to a change in policy which will have a material impact on what Israel is able to do in Gaza. There was a plausible mechanism. There is no plausible mechanism by which, if only the left were to more loudly support the protests in Iran, that would shorten the ability or shorten the reign of the Ayatollah. Like I don't.
Ayatollah Khomeini being like, oh no, we've lost Michael Walker.
Yeah, now maybe we'll give in to the protesters' demands. It's like I don't understand what the mechanism is by which it really matters.
But I do just think that so much of this is basically like Twitter brain or like social media brain, because it's about what you say online and how all your utterances build up an image of who you are. And it's nothing to do with actual politics proper. And again, this isn't something which is unique to, whether it's JK Rowling or Sarah Vine or whoever it is. It's also something which impacts the left because we all spend our time on lots of social media. But I think that it's a direct consequence of that. So the reason why the genocide in Gaza is so dear to so many people's hearts and become such a big part of their politics, it's not just because it's a bad thing that's happening in the world. It's because it's a genocide which has been materially supported by Western governments. So our democratically elected government, who's supposed to be accountable to us, has, granted arms licenses, or in the case of America, billions of dollars in military aid, provided diplomatic cover and all the rest of it. So we go, all right, as you said, there's a mechanism here, right? There's us, the electorate, the demos, whatever. There's a government who's supposed to be answerable to us, and this is a government that is helping Israel carry out its decades-long project of ethnic cleansing and the genocide in Gaza. Whereas I think that JK Rowling and Sarah Vine seem to be suggesting that posting by itself is inherently a mechanism, even when there aren't any meaningful diplomatic, economic, or geopolitical ties between the country where we are and the government that's enacting an injustice. If that's what you think, that tweets are that powerful, that it's a point of view. I just don't think it's a particularly serious one.
Well, also, I mean, the issue is even worse in a way, because the only and this is why I think maybe some people on the left don't want to sort of speak about it. I mean, I personally, obviously we've just done a show about it, but it is because they perceive that to speak about the only mechanism by which the West can have a real impact on whether or not the Ayatollah stays the Ayatollah is by taking actions which will probably have a net negative impact on Iranian people, which
like
is
calling for airstrikes.
Airstrikes or increased sanctions. Now, obviously, like increased sanctions have put Iran into poverty over previous years. They were actually doing quite well on the Human Development Index, aren't they? I was looking. Obviously, I haven't converted to suddenly being in favour of sort of theocratic regimes under the Ayatollah Khamenei.
For the Human Development
it's not really
Index.
my vibe. But I do. I love charts, and I think people do think about Iran as if it's a bit like Afghanistan under the Taliban. And now Afghanistan under the Taliban, as far as I can tell, I haven't seen any charts that make you feel like, oh, maybe I should rethink Afghanistan under the Taliban. But Iran, very good for the Human Development Index, they've been. I think between 1990 and 2012, they had the second biggest increase of anywhere in the world. South Korea was top. And by lots of accounts, obviously women are major oppressed in Iran. I'm not in favor of mandating people wear hijabs, but it is also the case that the majority of people who have graduated from university are women. So again, just to be clear, I'm not saying it's brilliant for women's rights, but it's not the Taliban.
No, but that's an important thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about these protests. And so again, I don't think any of us are realistically looking to Sarah Vine or columnists in The Telegraph or JK Rowling to help us understand the Iranian protests better. All right. What they're doing is, some finger wagging because they feel it's getting one over on people that were atting them unkindly. But this thing that you just said about female participation in higher education in Iran is actually really important because there is an incoherence in terms of, the aims and objectives of the Iranian regime. On the one hand, they actually want high levels of participation in education by women, particularly in STEM subjects. So they're like, we want the missile to be built by a hijabi, right? They want that. And on the other hand, what they also want is to have, really strict morality codes. A morality police, which while it's supposed to have been formally disbanded, is really just turned into a form of digital surveillance and monitoring. So you've got all these women participating in university. Participation in university, particularly for women, tends to have a liberalising effect. And then you're saying, okay, you've got this education. We want you to have, a career in STEM, but you also have to abide by the morality doctrine of the supreme leader. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster if you're running a theocracy. So I actually think that these nuances, if you were saying this in front of an audience of centrist pundits, they'd look at you citing female participation in higher education and go, Michael's an apologist for the Iranian regime. Whereas actually, if you look at that, it helps you understand these protests a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to sit down with Sarah Devine and JK Rowling and say, so what are your thoughts on the protest beyond seeing it as an excuse to say, these lefties love theocrats? I mean, I don't know how much maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they could write a really interesting comment piece about Iran, but I haven't seen it from their Twitter feeds so far. London's crime epidemic is scaring tourists away. Crime is soaring in London, but Sadiq Khan wants to spend £66 million on wokery. London is a crime-infested left-wing dystopia. These are all real headlines from the past year. I'm just going to show you the most ridiculous one, which is the GB News one. London is a crime-infested left-wing dystopia. That was from Matt Goodwin, their resident demographic doom scroller. Anyway, this is a message that's been pushed aggressively over the past couple of years, particularly on Elon Musk's X. So he's always boosting comments about how dangerous London is, how it's too terrifying for anyone to walk around. It's really, really gone to the dogs. Not just the dogs, it's hell. London is hell. Today, though, we've had more confirmation that this narrative is just wrong, frankly. New data released by the Met shows that 97 people were murdered in 2025 in London, which is the lowest level since 2014. And when you consider how London's population has grown since then, it means that the murder rate in London is lower than ever since records began. Sadiq Khan spoke to Sky this morning to welcome that news.
Even our harshest critics will have to accept the progress we've made is quite remarkable. The lowest number of murders in London ever on a per capita basis since records began. The fewest number of under-25s killed this century. the fewest number of teenagers killed in 3 decades. And we've had a sustained focus on a public health approach, being tough on crime, on enforcement, supporting the police, doubling investment from City Hall, and tough on the complex causes of crime, early intervention and prevention by setting up England's first violence reduction unit.
So when Sadiq Khan there spoke about his harshest critics, he may have been talking about Donald Trump, who said this to GB News in November.
Look at the crime you have in London. My mother loved London. She loved that city. She'd always talk about, that was a different London than you have today. Today you have people being stabbed in the ass or worse. But no, it's crazy.
It's true. It's awful. Crazy. It is. It feels much safer here.
Your mayor is a disaster.
So, lots to say about what Trump said there, but Bev Turner, who's the GB News person doing the interviewer, saying she feels so much safer, I presume they're in Washington, D.C. I think she's the D.C. sort of correspondent for GB News now. She's saying it feels so much safer in Washington, D.C. than London. Now, let's go back to the data, right? Because the murder rate in London is now 1.1 person per 100,000. So for every 100,000 people in London, 1.1 people is murdered every year. Obviously, you'd want that number to be 0, but 1.1 is lower than most places. Ash, can you guess how high it is in Washington, D.C.?
I am really bad at numbers, but I know it's mega high.
It's 27 times higher. 27 per 100,000 people. Now, obviously, we shouldn't laugh about this because this is terrible for Washington, D.C.
But Beverly Turner feels safer there.
She feels safer there.
She feels safer. Maybe she's the one doing the killing in Washington, D.C. I don't know.
Good for her. Maybe she's really packing. Okay, Ash, what do you make of this? Maybe people say there's no point in looking at these stats because these people don't care about numbers. What they're actually pissed off about is ethnic minorities, and crime was just a sort of front for that. But...
yeah. That is true. And we've talked about this before, right? Which is that feeling safe is not always a reflection of the objective risks in your environment. So I'm much more likely to, excuse me, I'm much more likely to have my phone nicked by someone on an e-bike now than I was when I was a kid, because this is a form of crime which has really emerged over the past 5 years or so. But that doesn't mean I'm at more risk just because this kind of crime is more likely to happen.
Well, you are more at risk of getting your phone stolen. You're just not more at risk of, you're at less risk of getting murdered.
I just couldn't finish the sentence.
Oh, you could. I was like, I really need to help Ashley. I think she's forgotten what her point was.
No,
she's got something stuck in her throat.
I just had a frog in my throat. What I mean is that I'm not more at risk of serious harm just because there is this form of crime which is more likely to happen, which makes me feel more unsafe or more vulnerable in the street, right? I would much prefer to have my phone nicked than to be stabbed in the ass, as Donald Trump so memorably put it. But my feeling of what the risks are versus what are the actual risks in my environment don't always line up, right? And also, forms of petty crime, they make you feel more hyper alert to more serious kinds of crime. That's a part of human psychology. The other thing is that because of social media and also social media's ability to recycle clips which might be really old, is that you're bombarded with images which make you feel like, London is a hellhole. And it might be that you're put into contact with something that geographically you would have been completely unaware of, because unless you're reading the local newspaper, that would never have been covered. Or it might be a clip of video from 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And because, this is the way social media algorithms work, but also because you've got, engagement farming accounts whose job it is to basically terrify you, because then you'll view it and you'll share it. Again, that creates a sense of risk. And then you've got, I think, what you talked about, which is the ethnic dimension of it, which is we've got a mayor of colour who's a Muslim. That can't be allowed.
There's a lot there. There was a statistic that I found really interesting this week as well. It was polling. We'll get it up in a moment, but to sort of intro it, because we talk about this a lot, sort of this perception that people have that crime is going up. And I suppose there's a couple of arguments that are made. So one argument that's made is that it's just because the media is lying to them. And the other argument is that while some crimes might be going down, so say murder, for example, has been going down for a while, and overall crime, sort of the total number of people reporting that they've been a victim of crime in a particular year, that's the crime survey by the ONS, that's also down. There's an argument that certain crimes are up, and it's those crimes which people really associate with disorder. And so even if less people are getting murdered, more people are seeing shoplifting happening, more people are worried that their phone's going to get stolen. And so there is a genuine perception, independent from the media, that crime is going up because the world just seems more disorderly when you walk around in it. And I don't dismiss either of those. There is, though, some polling this weekend that I think really sort of argues in favour of the media argument, that this actually has nothing to do with people's lived experiences, all about what they see on their smartphone. And it is a brilliant question that YouGov polled on who thinks London is an unsafe place to live. And if you look at it, the majority of people in the UK think it's an unsafe place to live. And sort of the political split is as you'd imagine. So sort of Lib Dems think it's generally safe. Reform voters think it's really unsafe. They're the people who've been watching GB News that tell you it's a hellhole all the time. But the really breakdown here is that everyone in the UK, so this is the bottom half, or sorry, the middle part of that graphic that you can see there, everyone in the UK thinks that London is really unsafe, apart from Londoners. So a big majority of everyone thinks that London is really unsafe, apart from people who live in London, who overwhelmingly think it's safe. So 2/3 of people who live in London think it's safe, and 2/3 of people who don't live in London think it's unsafe. So this, to me, suggests that this isn't about, lots of smart people argue, and I've been at times sort of convinced by this argument that it's, yes, even though crime is falling, people do have this lived experience sense of disorder on the rise. This, to me, suggests that actually people have just been looking at too much shit on their smartphone.
I mean, I do think that that's true. Like, I do think that that's true. It's something which, my in-laws live up north, and like, it'll often be a joke of like, oh, might get stabbed in London. I'm like, it's fine. Like, it's really fine. Made it 33 years without getting stabbed, and that's despite running my mouth. And I think that there are certain rules of thumb, right? Which is, no one is going to be a good authority on other places where they don't live. All right? Everyone, to a degree, stereotypes and reduces cities, towns, regions that they're not familiar with, right? And then you add on to that the way in which social media and, conventional forms of media like, broadcast and newspapers can paint a really warped, out of proportion picture of risk. Like, those two things together means that you end up with completely out of whack polling like that. I mean, I do think that there is something about the way in which, and this is something which is really quite old, which is London is always seen to be not really the country, right? And I'm not just talking about the ways in which, London has been a beneficiary of like really uneven patterns of investment and that kind of thing. It's sort of like, well, London doesn't really belong to England. It's not part of England. And one of my favourite quotes from Mansfield Park is, humour lady, you're talking about London. I am talking about the nation, as if these two things don't belong together. And so, London as a big city, in all the ways in which, it is that bit different, it can sort of be blown up out of proportion to be like, it's a ethnic minority caliphate, crime-riddled hellhole, right? It's not just unrepresentative of England, but somehow in terms of the experience of living there and also the values that it embodies, it's actively hostile to, the decent and proper backbone of English identity. It's always played that role. And I think that this is the form that it's taken today.
Someone said in the comments, how can it possibly be the case that crime has gone down when living standards have been stagnant? And it's because actually there is some relationship between poverty and crime, but it's not obvious. So I'm researching, obviously I've been reading a lot about Venezuela at the moment, and I'm going to be interviewing someone who used to work for Maduro on Friday. I think it will go out Saturday. But there was, social science had this really sort of difficult conundrum in the 2010s, because while the Chavez project was still going well, I suppose the 2000s and the early 2010s. So poverty was massively going down, but crime exploded, like violent crime exploded. And apparently people in the regime were like, what? I thought when we reduced poverty, crime would go down. But it turns out there are loads of other variables.
Well, and another like massive variable in crime is urbanization. So when you have people moving from place to place and you have communities being broken down and sort of recomposed, that has an effect on crime.
I don't know if Venezuela urbanized in that. I think from what I read, they thought it was more about changes in drug routes. But There we are. Let's wrap up, though. We've gone over time a little bit. Ash Sarkar, always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. And let me quote Jane Austen in a context where it was not relevant at all.
Oh, always quote Jane Austen. I feel like I should read more classical literature to make myself a more valid human being, but it's still on the to-do list. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.